Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Hope Partnership for Missional Transformation's webinar, 5 Common Mistakes That Churches Make When Visioning and How to Avoid Them. My name is Matt Rosine. I'm Minister for Congregational Planning Resources here at Hope Partnership, and I'm happy to welcome you all on today for our webinar. I want to, at the very beginning here, offer a few ways to participate. I want you to know that all of the phone lines have been muted. So if there's any background noise where you are, you don't have to worry about it. We can't hear that. However, at the end of our session today, probably in about 20 or 25 minutes, I will unmute the phone lines so we can have some conversation. So if you have a question that comes to mind during the presentation, just jot it down. And then at the end of our session, I'll make an announcement that we'll be unmuting the phone lines, and you can feel free to answer or ask those questions and answer them if you'd like at that time. So feel free to keep a record of the questions you have. Also, if you have a question that comes up during the presentation, you'll notice there's a chat box in the lower left-hand corner. You're welcome to use that, and I'll do my best to keep up with questions that come in throughout the presentation. Finally, at the end of our session today, you'll receive an email with a comment form. We'd like to use that to suggest possible future topics that we could look at here at Hope Partnership for webinars, and any other feedback you have about how we can improve this for you. We are going to record today's session, and it will be available on our website within a week or two. So keep in touch with us at www.hopepmt.org for those recordings and for other information. At the end of the session, I'll give a couple of announcements about some upcoming events that we have here at Hope. But let's just go ahead and jump right in, and let's talk about these mistakes that churches make when they're doing visioning. Why do churches need a vision? It's pretty important. When we look at Scripture, we see that there's a passage in Luke 4 where Jesus describes his vision for his ministry. He says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And with that quotation from Isaiah, what Jesus is doing is he is pronouncing the vision of his ministry. He's saying something about the world that isn't necessarily happening yet, but that he is going to help fulfill. And that's what a church vision does. It provides hope for the future. It tells us about what's going to be happening in God's imagination, but it also gives us meaning for what we're doing today. And that's an important function of a church's vision. We've noticed a lot of common characteristics in churches that don't have a sense of vision or a widespread sense of vision. One thing we notice is that people will say about the church that it just feels like we're going through the motions. You know, every Sunday kind of feels like a repeat of the last Sunday. Every board meeting is a repeat of our previous conversations at other board meetings. And every week, every month kind of feels the same way. And that's what happens when churches don't spend time visioning for the future. It kind of begins to feel like we're just going through the motions. And it's important for churches then to have a vision so that they're not just stuck going through those motions. What we also notice in churches that have a vision is that that the newcomers, that visitors to the church, are slow to get involved. So one thing we've learned is when a church doesn't have a vision, the first people to notice that are your newcomers, people who are new to the church. They're the first ones who are going to notice that there's not a new vision for the church. Why is that? Well, when we look around in congregations, people who've been there for a while, people who've been involved in church for a long time, have jobs to do. They have roles to fulfill. They have relationships that they've formed. And so they all are included in the system, but it's when a new person comes in or a visitor comes to worship, they look around and see that everybody's busy, everybody's got friends, but they don't necessarily have that same sense of involvement or sense of relationship with the church. And they're the ones who are going to notice that there's not a plan for involving new people, that there's not a new vision for the church. And so usually it's your newcomers, your new people, who don't have a sense, or who notice that the church doesn't have a sense of vision. Finally, another characteristic of churches that are lacking vision is there's a low sense of impact. And what I mean by that is the church doesn't have a sense that it's doing much beyond its walls. A few people may notice that there's an impact, but there's not a widespread sense of impact. And so it's important. Churches need to have vision. So let's get right into these mistakes that churches make that we notice. The first mistake that churches make is that their visioning processes tend to be heavy on strategy but light on spirit. Think about that for a second. A lot of congregations will put their most spiritual people on the committee for worship or on the committee for evangelism. But when it comes to the strategic planning committee or to the long-range planning committee, if a church has that, they're likely to put their business leaders on that or people who've had experience with management or something like that. And what happens is all those so-called spiritual people are doing other tasks, and that leaves the long-range planning or the visioning to the secular folks, the folks who have a really good sense of what those business needs are. And what happens is we leave out the work of the Spirit when we're doing strategic planning. The truth is visioning is just as Spirit-led as any other activity in a church. In fact, we could make the case, I think, that it's even more critical that we look to the Holy Spirit for our wisdom and our discernment of that vision, of that new vision. That means our visioning process needs to be shaped by prayer, by Bible study, by discernment, by talking with one another in holy conversations, not just business-like conversations. What that means is a church needs to leverage its sense of trust between people. Churches that have a high sense of trust are going to go through a visioning process much easier than churches where folks don't have trust with one another, where there's a lot of strife or conflict. It's going to be much harder to do a visioning process in a church like that because it's a Spirit-led process, because we have to learn to trust one another and trust the work of God in that process. So at Hope Partnership, when we work with congregations in visioning, what we suggest is that the congregation aims to get at least 50% of the church involved in a regular, small group-based experience of God's Spirit. What do we mean by that? Well, regular, meaning this isn't just a one-time thing. We can't just expect people to come to a one-day church retreat and start the meeting with a 10-minute prayer and then do visioning and we're done. No, it needs to be an ongoing process of building relationships and listening for God's Spirit. So we would suggest maybe 30 days, 60 days, even 90 days of prayer groups, small prayer groups or Bible study groups or reflection groups that are studying a book together. We always start visioning processes in churches with this Spirit-led process, with this spiritual preparation. And we have resources that we recommend for churches when they work with us at Hope Partnership. The reason this is important, the reason it's important to start with this Spirit-led preparation is because congregational transformation only comes about when there's personal transformation. That's really the necessary first step. Churches can only change when people themselves have begun to experience change in a powerful way. You've probably seen this in your own life. You've probably seen this in the lives of other people, that when we're open to the movement of God in our personal lives, when we're open to letting God change us in some way, that's when we also begin to see change in our congregations. Now, the other part of this is to notice that congregational transformation isn't the goal. The goal isn't just to say, oh, our church has changed and we're doing something different. No, the goal, if we follow these arrows around, really is community transformation. That's the final outcome of a church that's being transformed by a new vision of God. It's not going to be that the church is different. It's that the community around the church is going to be different. So that's mistake number one, that churches tend to be heavy on strategy, light on spirit. Mistake number two, oftentimes we overlook the changing context around us. We tend to approach visioning or strategic planning as though the world really hasn't changed in the last 20 or 30 years. And we look at our strategic plan from maybe 15 years ago and we say, okay, let's tweak this, let's add a few more goals, and we're going to go at it again, only working harder this time. But the truth is our context is changing rapidly. You don't need someone on a webinar conversation to tell you that. We can all see that in our own lives and our own communities, that our context is changing. Technology, information, communication, global village, all of those things are indicators of how quickly our world is changing. And so the question we have to ask at the beginning of any visioning process is this question right here. Who are our neighbors today? Not who were our neighbors 50 years ago. Maybe your church was built 50 years ago or your church started 50 years ago in that neighborhood. But the truth is those neighbors have changed in the last 50 years. Not even who were our neighbors 15 years ago or 10 years ago, but who are our neighbors today. We are living in a world that commutes more than we ever have, that's much more transient than it ever has been, and so our neighborhoods are changing just about every decade, and it's important for our churches to change about every decade to adapt to that kind of new reality. The other important thing about our changing context is to know we can't just assume that because we drive across town to go to church, but other people will be willing to do that too. You know, a lot of us drive 10, 20, 30 minutes to go to our church, and that's fine for us, but we can't assume that that's going to be true for everybody. You know, the truth is most of our communities are filled with what are called psychological barriers. What do I mean by psychological barriers? Well, psychological barriers or psychological boundaries are geographic features, like you're seeing on the screen here. They can be rivers, they can be railroads, they could be interstate highways, but they are psychological boundaries. These are features of our community that people typically will not cross in order to attend church, unless they have a family connection to that church or a historical connection to that church. Some of you might be thinking, well, I drive over 2 or 3 of those boundaries to get to my church. Well, often that's because we grew up in that church or we have a family connection to that church, and so we're certainly willing to drive across those boundaries. But today, even in our mobile society, those boundaries are extremely powerful in a lot of our communities, and people won't cross those. And so it's important when we're doing any kind of a visioning process to notice who your community is from an outsider's perspective. It helps to have someone who's not part of the community come in and examine your community and draw a map like we just looked at on the screen, to maybe sit down with some of your leaders and talk about what those powerful psychological barriers are in your community. Every community is going to be different. Small rural communities need to be mapped a different way than large urban communities. And so when we work with churches through Hope Partnership, this is one thing that we do, is we sit down with that outsider's perspective and help congregations name their ministry context for today. And in doing that, we also help them name ministry needs that are present today. So when you map your community, it's important to note psychological barriers. It's also important to look at the key lifestyle groups that are going to be found in your community. You know, people who live in apartment complexes frequently have different outlooks and different ministry needs than people who live in well-established homes, well-established single-family homes. Doesn't mean they're completely different people. Obviously, they're still people, but the way they look at life and the way they have need is going to be different. Same is true of single parents raising kids on their own versus families where there's 2 parents raising kids at home. Those are going to be different situations, and while there's commonalities, there's going to be a different set of ministry needs that your church might be overlooking that's just right across the street or right down the street. So one thing we help churches do is to determine your target context, your target demographic. And one of the powerful tools that we use at Hope Partnership is a tool called Mosaic Lifestyle Groups. There are 71 of these different lifestyle groups throughout the country, and we can help you name what the ones are, what those Mosaic groups are that are found closest to your community. We'd be happy to help you do that. So mistake number 3 then is when churches don't assess what they actually have to work with. It's when we dream and we have all these great goals and all these wonderful visions, but we don't actually take into account what we have right now in our hands that God can use to make that vision a reality. So this is why a lot of churches that do visioning and why a lot of churches that do strategic planning don't end up actually implementing anything. We dream and we finally put that great vision statement embroidered on the wall in the parlor, but it doesn't actually become a reality. And that's because frequently we don't take into account what we have to work with. So we encourage churches to do a resource assessment, and we actually have some tools where we could do this for you or help you do it yourself. But a resource assessment is simply taking into account all of the financial resources that you have to work with as a church, all of the facility resources that you have, all of the location resources that you have to work with, and finally also the people and the different types of people and giftedness of people who are in your church. That's what we mean by a resource assessment. It really helps to use an outside set of eyes when you're doing a resource assessment. And the reason for that is just because we tend to approach our church with the same outlook every time we see it. Imagine, you walk into your church's sanctuary and you always see that torn place in the carpet, or you see the cobwebs up there in the rafters. And that's typically because we approach our church either with rose-colored glasses and we see what's really a more favorable picture of our church, or we look at our church with whatever the opposite of rose-colored glasses are, which would be that when we look at our church with a pessimistic attitude, as though we're never going to have enough. And frankly, churches typically have more than they think they have in terms of resources, and that's one of the great blessings we get to do in working with churches through resource assessment, is helping them see that they really are more blessed than they think they are. So mistake number 3 is when we do visioning, but we don't actually take into account the resources that we have available to us. What's mistake number 4? Mistake number 4 is when we only survey the congregation. We've seen lots of congregations that do visioning, and they do strategic planning looking to the future, and the first thing they do is they poll the congregation. They work up a long survey, and they hand it out in worship, or they put it in the newsletter and send it out, and they ask the congregation essentially, what is it you want us to do in the next 3 or 4 years? What do you want this church to be doing? What do you think our goals need to be? And while that's an okay process, it can't be the only process. What we've noticed in a lot of those church surveys over the years is that most of the time the feedback that's received from those surveys is where people say, I pretty much like the direction we're going, I just want to do more of it, and I want to work harder to make that happen. It's basically a somewhat improved version of the status quo. And some of the other feedback people get when they do those church surveys is they get 3 or 4 negative responses about what people don't like that's happening in the church or what the people don't like about their pastor. And what that does is that ends up leading people to feel really deflated about their church and giving up some hope for their congregation. And we would rather see the congregation stay in that place of appreciation. What is it you love about your church, and how can you increase that? So one way to do that is to not just survey the church, but to also survey the community, people around the church who are not part of the day-to-day congregation. Ask those folks, what kind of church do you think is needed in our community? Now, that's a completely different question than just asking the folks in the church. There may be some similarities, yes, but you're also going to learn some things that you probably didn't know when you asked that question. What kind of church do you think our community needs? When you ask people in the community that, you're going to get all kinds of wonderful information back, but even more than the information, you're going to have built a relationship with some of those folks, which will help you fulfill that vision. The relationships will help fulfill the vision. And so when we work with congregations through our visioning opportunities, we say that face-to-face conversation is always best for this kind of data. It's best not to send out a survey or do something online, but really it's better just to sit down face-to-face. And we have some tools for how churches can do that through interviews, how they can do that by walking around their neighborhood. For example, we have a church in Texas that had a creative approach when they enlisted their youth group to walk up and down the streets around the church during youth group time for a couple of Sundays and just stop and ask people who are out in the yard, what is it you love about this neighborhood? What do you love about this neighborhood? Why did you move here? They ask questions like that, which people were happy to respond to. Now, that's a different approach than when people are walking around the neighborhood with clipboards and they say, what are you looking for in a church? Or what would attract you to our church? That's a different approach altogether. But instead, it's a question of saying, what is it you guys already love about your community? And then what else that Texas church did is they said, what would you love to see in this community that's not already here? And that just opened up the doors for some great conversation that helped that church through its visioning process. Finally, the other thing that we've learned that's really helpful is doing community conversations. So one of the features of our retreat that we offer through our Mission Pathways service is it's a one-day retreat for the church, but part of that one-day retreat is when the church invites some community members and some community leaders to participate at the retreat for a couple of hours. And so we have a couple dozen people from the community in the room and a couple dozen people from the church. And we facilitate a conversation that allows for this tremendous knowledge sharing between the community and the church. And they come away from that retreat not only with a set of needs that the community has that are in real time, that are extremely critical for that community, but they also come away with a set of opportunities and ministry partners who can help the church fulfill their vision. I like what David Hyatt says. David just made a comment here through our chat feature. He says, asking this question, how about asking God what God wants us to do and what kind of church does the Lord want us to become? That's another way of saying that spiritual preparation, David, that's the very beginning process, is God, we're going to place this church in your hands, and we want you to fashion us into the kind of people who can serve this community. Fantastic. Let's look at mistake number 5. Mistake number 5 is assuming that implementation will just happen. How often does this happen? How often do we do this? That we spend all of this time, we spend people's resources in putting together a beautiful vision. We get a few people inspired behind it. We get the church involved with it. And then what happens? The wheels kind of fall off and we lose interest. And the next thing you know, we're just kind of back at doing the same thing over and over again that we did before. Implementing change is not easy. It doesn't take a PowerPoint presentation to say that, does it? We all know that. We feel that every day. It's true in our daily life. It's true in our churches. Implementing change is tough stuff. And so we know that the inertia of the status quo is going to pull us right back into what we've been doing and what we're comfortable with. And so one of the features of our services when we work with congregations in visioning is we help the church see that transformation doesn't happen through addition. It comes through subtraction. What I mean by that is it comes through a process of letting go, asking God to show us what we need to let go of if our church is going to be faithful. There was a time 20 or 30 years ago when churches had more resources, when transformation and visioning was really about addition. And we could add, okay, our plan in the next 3 years is we're going to add this to our budget, and we're going to add this type of staff person. We're going to add this new wing onto our building. And it was a process of expansion and getting larger and larger. But the truth is now those resources aren't as available as freely as they were. And so instead of just adding and adding and adding, we need to ask God to show us what we need to let go of and what we need to prune. And that's what we mean when we say that transformation comes through subtraction. It helps to create a plan, a vision, and widely share it with folks. That's one way to make sure implementation will happen, is to make sure it's not just the custody of a small group of people, but when the whole church can see the plan and can get involved and can push back a little bit and have their feedback in it, then extremely important, and that'll lead to implementation. Finally, the other feature that we found is extremely important when doing implementation is to have a coach who can help the church stay on track. When we work with churches through our mission pathways and through our New Beginning services, we always include a coaching relationship. That's a new thing that we've done in the last few years. We want the church to succeed with implementation, and we've discovered through our new church ministry in the Disciples of Christ that when you have a coach that pastor can talk to on a regular basis, then that helps the pastor and in turn the whole church stay focused on the goals for the future and not just getting sucked back into that day-to-day routine. It's so critical to have a coach, somebody who's not a part of the congregation. Usually the coach is 100 or 1,000 miles away, but somebody they can talk to, somebody who can listen, someone who can ask questions to help them stay focused on those goals, and that will help lead to the implementation. Well, so what could we do to help? If you're looking to start a visioning process, or maybe you've done one recently and it didn't work out the way you expected, or maybe this is something you're in the middle of right now, we'd be happy to help you out. Hope Partnership has a fairly new service called Mission Pathways, which is essentially a suite of ministry planning resources that your congregation can use. And these are ranged from $250 up to about $3,000, and it just depends on the amount of travel and the amount of work that you all want to do as a congregation. But we'd love to help you. We'd love to be involved in your congregation's development of a vision. So this can include all kinds of different pieces here. We can do a resource assessment. I mentioned how important that was. Talked about the demographic and lifestyle group analysis. That's something else we could help you with by naming some of those essential target groups that are found right in your community. We talked about a weekend-long visioning retreat where we involve the community in conversation. That's another feature of our Mission Pathways service. And then webinars like today to help your leaders stay up to date with some changes that are happening, but also to give training without the cost of travel and all that. And then finally, coaching. We include coaching with our Mission Pathways service too, so that churches can be a little better positioned to implement the changes that they found. If you want to know a little bit more about all this Mission Pathways information, I point you to our website. The website that we have for Hope Partnership is hopepmt.org. And when you get to the website, you'll see a button in the upper right-hand corner that says Transform. Just click that button and you'll see an option to read about Mission Pathways. There you can find out more about the different pricing tiers for Mission Pathways, different options that are available. But also you can share this information with your church leaders. You can even print off some of the pages and take it to your next board meeting. And you can also download a request form. We'd also like to just stay in touch, and so I'm going to put my contact information up here. If you have any more questions about mission pathways or ways that Hope could help you in visioning, there's my email address and phone number. Please feel free to contact me. I'd love to stay in touch. And at this point, I think what I'd like to do is go ahead and unmute the phones. And if you have questions, I imagine we'll have some people who will go ahead and take off at this point, and that's fine. We thank everybody for participating today. But if you want to stick around, you have